the remote expanse of the Black Hollow Mountains, a lone hiker was about to make a discovery that should have stayed buried. A quiet expedition into the wilderness turned deadly when something ancient stirred beneath the earth. Daniel Holt wasn't just another weekend explorer. For nearly a decade, he had been an investigative journalist, renowned for uncovering hidden truths in places most feared to tread. His work had exposed government cover-ups, unearthed forgotten histories, and led him to the darkest corners of human nature. When he stepped into the cave that wasn't on any map, following a trail of fresh footprints into the abyss, he had no idea he was walking into something far older and far more aware than anything he had ever encountered. The deeper he ventured, the more the cave seemed to shift around him, twisting its corridors, erasing his path back. What began as a curious detour into an uncharted cavern would become a descent into something beyond time itself. The mountains would never speak of what happened to Daniel Holt, but if they did, they would whisper only one thing: he was not alone in there. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Daniel Holt adjusted his pack as he stepped over a fallen log, the weight settling comfortably against his shoulders. The Black Hollow Mountains stretched before him, ancient and indifferent to his presence. That was exactly why he kept coming back. Nature didn't care about his past. It didn't whisper Elliot's name when the wind rustled through the leaves. It didn't remind him of promises broken and lives lost. 5 miles in, another 2 to the ridge. He murmured to himself, checking his GPS unit before tucking it away. His voice sounded hollow in the vastness of the forest, a reminder of just how alone he was, exactly as he wanted. 3 days of solitude stretched ahead of him. 3 days to escape the pitying glances, the careful conversations that always seemed to circle back to the accident. 5 years had passed since Elliot's fall, but in the small town where Daniel lived, memories lingered like ghosts. The midday sun filtered through the canopy, dappling the forest floor with shifting patterns of light. Daniel maintained a steady pace, his boots crunching over fallen leaves and pine needles. He'd spent years perfecting his gear, lightweight, but durable, enough supplies to survive a week if needed. The journalist in him still insisted on preparation, even if he'd long since traded deadlines for distant horizons. Should reach the campsite by 4, he said, glancing at his watch. Another habit from his old life, narrating his thoughts as if preparing them for print. The accident had changed that too. These days his words stayed with him, trapped in the empty spaces between trees. As the trail narrowed, Daniel veered slightly off his planned route, intrigued by a rock formation he hadn't noticed on previous hikes. He'd explored most of Black Hollow over the years, mapping its contours in his mind like a second skin. Finding something new was rare. The rocks formed a natural arch, weathered by centuries of wind and rain. Beyond it, a steep ravine cut into the mountainside, thick with vegetation that didn't quite match the surrounding forest. Darker, denser, almost as if it were hiding something. Daniel's curiosity, the one part of his journalist past he couldn't shake, pulled him forward. He navigated down the ravine's edge, using exposed roots as handholds. At the bottom, the air felt different, cooler, stiller. The sounds of the forest above seemed muffled, as if he'd stepped into another world entirely. That's when he saw it, a dark opening in the rock face partially concealed by a curtain of vines. A cave entrance. Daniel frowned, checking his map again. There were no caves marked in this section of Black Hollow. Unmarked cave system, he muttered, excitement rising despite himself. Probably just overlooked during the geological survey. As he approached, something caught his eye, markings etched into the stone around the entrance. Not natural erosion, but deliberate carvings. Ancient symbols formed intricate patterns, spiraling curves, angular lines, and what appeared to be human figures walking into darkness. Daniel ran his fingers over the markings. They should have been weathered, barely visible after centuries exposed to the elements. Instead, they felt crisp, the edges sharp against his fingertips, as if they had been carved recently. "That's not possible," he whispered. He checked his phone. No service, as expected this deep in the mountains. But the camera still worked. He snapped several photos of the symbols, mentally composing a note to send to the university's archaeology department when he returned to civilization. Logic told him to mark the location and continue his planned route. But the entrance beckoned, a mystery waiting to be unraveled. Daniel flicked on his headlamp and ducked inside. The entrance tunnel widened quickly, opening into a chamber large enough that his light couldn't reach the far wall. The air was unexpectedly dry and the floor surprisingly level. Not the rough, uneven surface he'd expect from a natural formation. More symbols lined the walls, similar to those outside but more elaborate. They appeared to tell a story, figures entering the darkness, then disappearing into spiraling patterns that reminded Daniel of galaxies or whirlpools. "Hello?" he called out, immediately feeling foolish. His voice echoed briefly before being swallowed by the darkness. That's when he noticed them, footprints in the fine layer of dust covering the floor. Not ancient tracks preserved by the cave's stillness, but fresh impressions with crisp edges. Human footprints, smaller than his own, leading deeper into the darkness. Daniel's pulse quickened. "Hello? Is someone there?" He called again, louder, this time. Nothing but silence answered. He knelt to examine the prints more closely. They couldn't be more than a day old. Someone had been here. Someone who hadn't bothered to sign the trail registers or mention their discovery to the Park Service. The logical explanation was another hiker, perhaps as drawn to unexplored places as he was. But something about the prints made his skin crawl. They appeared and disappeared at random intervals as if their owner had been walking normally. Then suddenly, wasn't there at all. Daniel stood, his headlamp cutting through the darkness as he scanned the chamber. His journalistic instincts battled with a growing sense of unease. This was exactly the kind of story he would have pursued before. Mysterious cave, ancient symbols, unexplained presence. Just a quick look, he decided, following the footprints, then head back to the trail before sunset. The main chamber narrowed into a corridor that curved gently downward. The symbols continued along the walls, but they were changing subtly. The human figures now appeared distorted, elongated. Their arms reached outward as if grasping for something just beyond reach. Daniel walked for what felt like 20 minutes, the passage continually sloping deeper into the earth. The air grew colder, but remained strangely dry. The footprints continued appearing and disappearing at random intervals. When the passage finally opened into another chamber, Daniel stopped short. The beams of his headlamp illuminated more carvings, but these were different, more precise, more recent. And at the center of the far wall, a larger carving depicted a solitary figure standing before what appeared to be the mouth of a cave. A figure that looked disturbingly like him. "That's not possible," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible even to himself. A cold draft whispered past his ear, carrying what almost sounded like his name. Daniel spun around, heart hammering against his ribs. "Who's there?" Only silence answered. Suddenly aware of how far he'd ventured from the entrance, Daniel decided he'd seen enough. He turned back the way he'd come, walking briskly through the narrow passage. The darkness felt heavier now, pressing against the beam of his headlamp like a living thing. When he reached what should have been the main chamber, Daniel stopped, confusion washing over him. Instead of the wide open space he'd passed through, earlier he faced a solid wall of rock, covered in those same spiraling symbols. "No," he muttered, tracing his hand along the cold stone. "This can't be right." He backtracked, certain he'd somehow taken a wrong turn, though the passage had no branches or forks. After 10 minutes of increasingly frantic searching, he was forced to accept the impossible. The entrance was gone. Daniel pressed his forehead against the cool stone wall, fighting against rising panic. His logical mind raced through explanations. He'd become disoriented, taken a wrong turn, or simply forgotten the exact path back. But deep down he knew Something about this place was wrong, deeply, fundamentally wrong, and he was trapped inside. Daniel pressed his palm against the solid rock that shouldn't exist, his breaths coming in shallow bursts. The wall before him, where the entrance should have been, remained stubbornly solid. He checked his compass 3 times, retraced his steps twice, but the result was the same. "This isn't happening," he muttered, the beam of his headlamp trembling slightly, with the shake of his head. "There has to be an explanation." His words bounced back to him, the cave's acoustics returning them with an unnatural clarity. Explanation, explanation. But the echo continued too long, shifting slightly. No explanation. Daniel froze, the hairs on his neck standing on end. That wasn't how echoes worked. He'd spent enough time in caves during his journalism days to know the difference between normal acoustics and whatever that was. "Keep it together," he told himself firmly. "The only way out is through." Having no choice but to press forward, Daniel turned away from the vanished entrance and moved deeper into the cave system. He kept his right hand on the wall, an old caver's trick to avoid getting lost in labyrinthine passages. The rough stone was cold beneath his fingertips, occasionally interrupted by the smooth indentations of carved symbols. 20 minutes into his exploration, Daniel noticed something odd about the symbols. When he looked directly at them, they appeared as he remembered: abstract spirals, angular patterns, and distorted human figures. But when they sat at the edge of his vision, they seemed to move, to shift subtly. Once, he could have sworn he saw a figure that looked exactly like himself, standing alone before a darkness that seemed to consume him from the feet up. "Just a trick of the light," he said aloud. "Trick of the light," came the echo, but then, "trick of the mind." Daniel's breath caught. He swung his headlamp toward the voice, but found only empty tunnel stretching ahead and behind. The beam flickered briefly, plunging him into darkness for a heart-stopping second before stabilizing. "Battery's getting low," he reasoned, though he'd charged it fully before the hike. "Need to conserve." He switched to his backup flashlight, keeping the headlamp off to save power. The handheld light cast longer shadows, the darkness between them deeper and more complete. As he continued forward, the shadows seemed to move, independently of his light's motion, sliding along the walls like liquid. The passage widened into another chamber, smaller than the first but tall enough that his light couldn't reach the ceiling. The air here felt different, heavier, as if it were pressing against his skin. Daniel walked slowly toward the center, where his flashlight illuminated a pool of surprisingly clear water. He knelt beside it, considering whether it was safe to drink. As he leaned forward, his light revealed not just his reflection but something else. A shadow behind his shoulder, a familiar silhouette that couldn't possibly be there. Daniel spun around, heart pounding. "Who's there? Who's there?" The cave returned, and then, "I'm here, Dan." That voice. Impossible yet unmistakable. The pitch, the inflection, the slight emphasis on his name, exactly the way Elliot used to say it. "No." Daniel shook his head vigorously. "You're not real. You can't be real. Not real. Can't be real." Echoed the cave, followed by a sound that might have been laughter, might have been sobbing. "Dan, help me." Daniel pressed his hands over his ears, but the voice seemed to bypass them entirely, speaking directly into his mind. "This isn't happening," he repeated louder now. "It's hypoxia, low oxygen levels making me hallucinate." The scientific explanation steadied him somewhat. He'd read about cave phenomena causing auditory hallucinations. Gas pockets, oxygen, deprivation, the psychological impact of complete darkness. All could explain what he was experiencing. None could explain why his flashlight was now illuminating a shadow that moved without him, stretching long fingers across the chamber wall. Daniel backed away, nearly stumbling into the water pool. "Stay rational," he commanded himself, though his voice shook. "Find another way out." He circled the chamber, searching for another passage, trying to ignore the shadows that seemed to follow just behind him. On the far side, he found what he was looking for, a tunnel leading deeper into the mountain. As Daniel stepped into it, his light caught something unnatural on the stone floor, something that didn't belong in this ancient, undiscovered place. A scrap of synthetic fabric, modern, blue nylon, frayed at the edges. Daniel knelt, examining it closely. Part of a backpack, perhaps, or a tent. He swept his light around and found more evidence of human presence. A broken carabiner, the melted remains of what might have been a plastic water bottle. Someone else was here, he whispered. This wasn't an archaeological discovery. This was the site of someone else's misfortune. Someone else. Someone else, came the echo, followed by, never alone here. Daniel ignored the voice, focusing instead on what the scattered supplies meant. Someone had ventured into this cave system before him. Someone who had potentially found another way out. Or someone who never left. Further along the passage, his light revealed more abandoned items. A rusted camping stove, a torn sleeping bag, energy bar wrappers dated from years before. It looked as if someone had camped here, perhaps when they realized they couldn't find their way out. In the center of what appeared to be an old campsite, Daniel found something that made his blood run cold. A backpack, torn, but largely intact, with a name tag still attached to the front pocket. Mira Caldwell, he read aloud, recognition dawning. The name had been in the local papers, a hiker who went missing in Black Hollow 5 years ago. Search parties had combed these mountains for weeks. They had never found a trace of her. Never found her. Never found her, echoed the cave then. Never found me, Dan. Daniel ignored the voice, Elliot's voice, and opened the backpack with trembling hands. Inside, nestled between a crushed first aid kit and a headlamp, with a shattered bulb, he found a leather-bound journal. The name inside the cover confirmed it. Mira Caldwell. He sank to the ground, his back against the cave wall, and opened the journal to its first entry. May 15th, 2019. Started my solo trek through Black Hollow today. Perfect weather, clear trails. Found something unexpected. A cave system not on any of my maps. Going to explore it tomorrow morning after camp is set up. Could be the adventure I've been looking for. Daniel flipped through more pages, his heart racing as he read entries that grew increasingly desperate. May 17th. Something's wrong. Can't find the entrance, been walking for hours. Cave seems to change when I'm not looking. May 20th, I think. The whispers won't stop. They know things about me, things no one should know. Date unknown. I saw myself on the wall today. Not a carving. Me. Like I was watching myself from outside my body. The cave is alive. It knows me now. The final entry was scrawled in shaky handwriting that barely resembled the neat script from the beginning. It feeds on regret. On the things we can't forgive ourselves for. It knows about David. How could it know? I never told anyone what really happened that night. The cave is showing me his face. Over and over. I think I'm not alone anymore. But what's in here with me isn't human. The journal ended there. Daniel closed it slowly, a chill spreading through him that had nothing to do with the cave's temperature. Mira had been here, had experienced the same phenomena he was experiencing now, and she had never been found. As he tucked the journal into his own pack, Daniel's flashlight flickered again, darkness swallowing the tunnel for several seconds, before the beam returned, weaker now. In that brief moment of blackness, he felt something brush against his shoulder, a touch as gentle as a breath. "Elliot?" he whispered before he could stop himself. "I'm right here, Dan. I've been waiting for you." The voice came from just behind him, no longer an echo, but clear and present, as real as the stone beneath his hands. And this time, when his light steadied, it illuminated a shadow that was not his own, stretching across the wall before him. A shadow that raised its hand in greeting, just as his brother used to do. Daniel stumbled backward, away from the shadow that wasn't his. In his haste, he dropped Mira's journal, pages fluttering open as it hit the cave floor. The shadow on the wall, Elliot's shadow seemed to watch him, its head tilted in that curious way his brother always had when something puzzled him. "You're not real," Daniel said, his voice surprisingly steady despite the hammering of his heart. "Elliot is dead." The shadow wavered like smoke in wind. "Dead, dead," re-echoed the cave, and then, "Not dead here." Daniel snatched up the journal and backed away, refusing to look at the shadow again. He'd read the entries, knew what Mira had written. It feeds on regret, on the things we can't forgive ourselves for. And God knew he had enough regret about Elliot to feed this place for centuries. He needed to keep moving. Standing still meant giving in to the hallucinations, to whatever game the cave was playing. Daniel picked a direction away from the shadow and walked with purpose, ignoring the whispers that chased him through the tunnels. The passages twisted in ways that defied logic, sometimes sloping up when they should have gone down, sometimes curving back on themselves in impossible loops. Time became meaningless. His watch still ticked, but Daniel no longer trusted it. Had he been walking for hours or minutes? The battery in his flashlight should have died by now, yet it continued to cast its beam, albeit weaker than before. When the tunnel suddenly opened into a larger chamber, Daniel almost walked straight into a wall of fabric. A tattered tarp stretched across a portion of the space, creating a makeshift shelter. Behind it, a soft, golden glow spilled out. "Hello?" Daniel called, immediately regretting breaking the silence. The light behind the tarp vanished instantly. "Hello, hello?" Mocked the cave, but no other voice followed. Cautiously, Daniel approached the shelter. "My name is Daniel Holt," he said, keeping his voice even. "I'm lost in here. I found your journal, Mira." For several long seconds, nothing happened. Then a whisper. Not an echo, but a real human whisper from behind the tarp. "You're not real. You're just another trick." The voice was female, hoarse, from disuse but unmistakably human. Daniel felt a surge of something he hadn't expected. Hope. "I'm real," he insisted, stopping a few feet from the tarp. "I found your backpack, your journal. You wrote about someone named David, about the cave knowing things." The tarp rustled and a face peered around its edge, gaunt, pale, with eyes too large and a thin face. Long, matted hair hung past shoulders hunched with tension. She looked at Daniel with a mixture of terror and desperate longing. "You're solid," she whispered, blinking rapidly. "Most of them aren't solid anymore." Daniel held perfectly still, afraid she might vanish if he moved. "I'm real," he repeated. "I got lost in here yesterday. The entrance disappeared." The woman, Mira, it had to be Mira, slipped out from behind the tarp. She wore layers of clothing, some her own, some looking salvaged from other abandoned supplies. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached toward him, stopping just short of touching. 5 years, Daniel said gently. "That's how long you've been missing." Mira's expression flickered between confusion and distress. 5? No, that can't be right. I've been here. She pressed her hands against her temples. "I don't remember anymore. The days all blur together." "You've been surviving all this time?" She gestured behind her, where Daniel could now see the remnants of a campsite. A small fire pit with embers still glowing. Carefully rationed supplies. Water collected in various containers from somewhere within the cave system. "The cave provides what you need to stay alive," she said, her voice taking on an odd cadence. "It doesn't want you to die. Death is..." She paused, searching for words. "Too simple." Daniel stepped closer. "What is this place, Mira?" Her eyes darted around the chamber as if checking for eavesdroppers. "It's a threshold," she whispered. "Not just a cave, a place between realities." She pointed to the symbols on the nearby wall. "They knew." The people who were here before. They left warnings. Warnings about what? Mira's eyes locked onto his with sudden intensity. It feeds on you. Not your body. Your essence. Who you are. It starts with your regrets. Your guilt. It uses those to crack you open. Then it starts taking your memories. Pieces of your identity. Her voice broke. I don't remember my mother's face anymore, or what my apartment looked like, or my job. Sometimes I wake up and can't remember my own name until I read it in my journal. Daniel felt a chill run through him. Mira had been a park ranger according to the news reports when she went missing. Strong, capable, an experienced outdoors woman. The person before him now was a shell, haunted and fragile. We need to find a way out, he said firmly. Mira laughed, a hollow sound without humor. There is no way out, not in the way you think. The entrances and exits, they move. They aren't fixed points. But you've survived this long. You must have found ways. To navigate, I follow the rules, she interrupted. I've learned what it wants, what it doesn't want. When to move, when to stay still. Her eyes darted to the shadows at the edge of their light. And when to run. Daniel noticed how she kept glancing over his shoulder, as if seeing something. He couldn't. What exactly is following us, Mira? She shook her head. Not what. Who? Each person who stays too long, they leave something behind. An echo. A shadow self that the cave keeps. Some of them still remember they were people once. Others. She shuddered. Others are just hunger now. As if on cue, a distant sound reached them. Not a whisper this time, but a soft shuffling like something dragging itself across stone. Mira's eyes widened. We need to move, now. She began stuffing items into a makeshift bag, a water container, what looked like dried mushrooms or cave fungi, a crude knife fashioned from stone. What is that? Daniel asked, straining to see into the darkness beyond their light. Someone who stopped being human, Mira said grimly. The cave took too much of them. She grabbed his arm, her fingers digging in with surprising strength. Listen to me. Whatever you see, whatever you hear, especially if it sounds like someone you... No, don't engage. Don't speak to it. The cave uses your connections, your emotions to pull pieces from you. Daniel thought of Elliot's voice calling to him, the shadow that moved like his brother. What if it's already started? Mira searched his face. Who did you lose? My brother, Daniel admitted. Hiking accident, 5 years ago. Something flashed across Mira's face. Recognition, then sadness. That's your crack. That's how it gets in. She tightened her grip on his arm. We all have one. Mine was David, my fiancé. I thought I'd made peace with his death. But the cave, it knew better. The shuffling sound grew louder, accompanied now by a wet, raspy breathing. We need to go deeper, Mira whispered, pulling him toward a narrow opening at the back of the chamber. Sometimes the way out is through. That doesn't make sense, Daniel protested, even as he followed. Nothing makes sense here, Mira replied. Time folds back on itself. Spaces connect that shouldn't. Physics bends. She peered into his eyes. Your mind will try to rationalize to make it fit what you know about reality. Don't. Accept that the rules are different here. As they slipped into the passage, Daniel heard it. A voice calling his name. Not Elliot's this time, but his own. Voice distorted and hungry. Behind them, something entered the chamber they'd just left. Something that cast a shadow shaped like a man, but moved in ways no human body should move. Don't look back, Mira hissed. Never look back in here. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Daniel fixed his eyes forward, focusing on following Mira's limping form as she navigated the twisted passage with practiced ease. The last thing he saw before they turned a corner was a handprint on the wall, 5 splayed fingers pressed into stone, as if the rock had been soft as clay, a handprint identical to his own. The narrow passage twisted like a serpent, forcing Daniel and Mira to move in single file. Daniel's flashlight cast a weak beam ahead, barely illuminating Mira's back as she navigated with the confidence of someone who had walked these paths countless times before. Behind them, the shuffling sounds had faded, but Daniel couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of eyes following their every move from within the very stone around them. "How do you know where you're going?" Daniel whispered, afraid to raise his voice. The cave had a way of throwing sounds back distorted, twisted into meanings he hadn't intended. Mira glanced back, her gaunt face half-shadowed. "I don't. Not exactly. But I've learned to feel the currents." "Currents?" "Air movement. Subtle changes in temperature. The way the darkness thickens in places." She paused, head tilted as if listening. "The cave is always shifting, but there are patterns if you stay long enough to see them." They continued in silence for what might have been minutes or hours. Time stretched and compressed unpredictably, like taffy being pulled and folded back on itself. Daniel's watch had stopped completely, the second hand frozen despite its battery being new. When the passage finally widened into another chamber, Daniel noticed something unsettling. The tunnel behind them had changed. Where they had entered through a narrow crevice barely wide enough for their shoulders, there was now a broad archway. "It changed," he said, pointing. Mira didn't even turn to look. "It does that. Never trust what's behind you." The chamber they entered was larger than the others, with a ceiling that rose beyond the reach of their lights. Strange formations hung from above, not stalactites but twisted shapes that resembled human limbs frozen in midair. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, each drop echoing with perfect clarity. Daniel swept his light across the walls, revealing more symbols, but these were different, more desperate, less methodical. Names and dates scratched into stone, tallies of days, and fragmented messages. "Help us, it watches, don't look." "Others," Mira said, noticing his attention. "Some from before my time, some—" Her voice trailed off. "Some?" Daniel prompted. "Some I knew, briefly. They found me like you did. They didn't listen." Daniel was about to ask what she meant, when a sound stopped him. A gentle footfall, not from Mira, but from somewhere in the shadows across the chamber. They both froze. "Don't look directly at it," Mira breathed, barely audible. "Peripheral vision only." Daniel kept his light, aimed at the floor, using his side vision to scan the darkness. At first he saw nothing, then movement, a figure standing perfectly still until it wasn't, shifting positions in the moments when he blinked. "What is it?" he whispered. "An echo," Mira replied. "Someone who stayed too long." The figure moved again, closer now. From the corner of his eye, Daniel could make out its general shape, human-like, but with proportions slightly wrong, as if someone had described a person to an artist who had never actually seen one. Then it spoke, and Daniel's blood turned to ice. "Dan?" The voice was Elliot's. Perfect. Unchanged. Exactly as Daniel remembered it. "Dan? I've been looking everywhere for you." Daniel's head snapped up instinctively, his light catching the figure full on. It was Elliot. His brother, 23 years old, just as he had been the day he died. Same tousled brown hair, same lean build, same faded blue hiking jacket he'd been wearing when he fell. His face broke into a relieved smile at being seen. "Thank God," Elliot said, stepping closer. "I thought I'd never find you." "Don't," Mira hissed, grabbing Daniel's arm. "It's not him." But it was him, every detail perfect. The small scar above his right eyebrow from a childhood accident. The way he stood with his weight shifted slightly to one side. Even the tiny rip in his jacket sleeve that their mother had been nagging him to mend. "Elliot?" Daniel's voice cracked. "It's me," Elliot said, smiling wider. "I've been trapped here since the fall. I didn't die, Dan. I ended up here somehow. Mira's fingers dug painfully into Daniel's bicep. Look at its eyes, she commanded. Daniel forced himself to look directly at Elliot's face, at his eyes, those familiar hazel eyes that had always crinkled at the corners when he smiled. But they weren't crinkling now. They were perfectly still, like painted glass. And behind them was nothing. An emptiness that made Daniel's stomach clench. "You let me fall," Elliot said, his voice still warm even as his expression hardened slightly. "You were supposed to check my harness. You promised Mom you'd keep me safe." The words hit Daniel like physical blows. The exact thoughts that had tormented him for 5 years, spoken aloud in his brother's voice. "I'm sorry," Daniel whispered, tears welling. "I should have checked. I should have been more careful." "Daniel, stop," Mira pleaded. "It's feeding on your guilt. Don't give it what it wants." Elliot, or the thing wearing Elliot's face, took another step closer. "But I forgive you, Dan. That's why I'm here. To tell you it's okay." He extended his hand. "Come with me. I found a way out." Part of Daniel, a desperate, grief-stricken part, wanted nothing more than to take that hand, to believe this was really Elliot, that there was a chance to make amends, to undo the past. "Please." Mira's voice broke through his. "Thoughts. It's how it takes you, how it took the others." Daniel looked at the outstretched hand, so achingly familiar, then back at those still empty eyes. "You're not Elliot," he said, his voice stronger than he expected. "My brother is dead." The figure's smile didn't waver, but something shifted. In its posture, a subtle wrongness that became more pronounced the longer Daniel looked. Its neck seemed too long now, its shoulders at an angle that human anatomy shouldn't allow. "Don't you want to fix things?" it asked, Elliot's voice tinged with something else, something older, hungrier. "Don't you want to take it all back? I can show you how." Daniel took a step backward. "No." The figure's face, still Elliot's in features but increasingly wrong in expression, hardened. "You're making a mistake. There's no other way out." "We'll find our own way," Daniel said, backing up further, keeping himself between the entity and Mira. The thing wearing Elliot's face went still, unnaturally so, like a photograph of a person rather than a person itself. Then its mouth stretched into a smile too wide for human lips. "You'll come back to me," it said, its voice no longer just Elliot's but layered with others, men, women, children, all speaking in unison. They always do. When the darkness gets too thick, when the whispers get too loud, when you start forgetting who you are. It retreated backward into shadow, its movement jerky like stop-motion animation. The darkness seemed to fold around it, swallowing it whole until nothing remained but those empty eyes, gleaming like distant stars before winking out. Mira tugged at Daniel's arm. "We need to move, now." They hurried toward the chamber's far side, where a low opening led to yet another tunnel. Daniel's mind raced, struggling to process what he'd just experienced. "That wasn't real," he said, more to himself than to Mira. "It was real," she corrected, "just not what it claimed to be." She glanced back nervously. "The echoes are getting stronger. That's not good." "What does that mean?" "It means the cave is interested in us, in you specifically." She pulled him through the opening into a tunnel that sloped steeply downward. "Sometimes it gets fixated on certain people. Their pain tastes better, I guess." Daniel shuddered at the image. "Where are we going?" "There's a place," Mira said, her voice taking on a distant quality that Daniel had come to recognize as her struggling to remember. "A chamber with light, natural light. I found it once, but the way was closed when I tried to return." She pressed her fingers to her temples. "I think it might be an exit, if we can find it again." The tunnel continued its descent, the air growing colder, damper. Daniel's flashlight beam caught crystalline formations on the walls that sparkled, like stars. "It's beautiful," he murmured, "despite everything." "Yes," Mira agreed softly. That's part of its trap too. Beauty to lure you deeper. As if to confirm her words, the tunnel suddenly opened into a breathtaking grotto. Phosphorescent fungi clung to the walls, casting everything in a soft blue glow. A still pool reflected the luminescence, making it seem as if they were walking among stars. And there, at the far end, was a crack in the ceiling through which a beam of what looked like daylight shone down. "There," Mira pointed, her voice rising with excitement. "That's it. That's what I remembered." They hurried forward, hope surging for the first time since Daniel had entered the cave. But as they approached the beam of light, it began to change, dimming, shifting, until it was no longer sunlight at all, but simply another phosphorescent growth, brighter than the others. The exit had vanished, or had never been there at all. Mira made a sound, half sob, half scream, and fell to her knees. "No, no, I saw it. I remember it." Daniel knelt beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "It's okay. We'll find another way." "You don't understand," she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "It's not just playing with us anymore. It's hunting us." Daniel helped Mira to her feet, her body trembling beneath his steadying hand. The false exit's light continued to glow mockingly, a reminder of how easily the cave could manufacture, hope only to snatch it away. "We need to keep moving," he said gently. "Standing still makes us easy targets." Mira nodded, wiping at her eyes with dirt-stained fingers. "Yes," she whispered. "Movement. Always movement." They left the beautiful grotto behind, choosing the only passage that led away from where they'd encountered the Elliot thing. Daniel noticed how Mira's steps had become less certain, her earlier confidence in navigating the cave now replaced by hesitation. She paused frequently, head tilted, as if trying to recall something vital that kept slipping away. "Are you okay?" he asked, after she stopped for the third time in as many minutes. She pressed her palms against her temples. "Something's wrong, more wrong than before. I can't remember." Her eyes darted to him, filled with a naked fear that made his chest tighten. "We've been here before, haven't we? In this tunnel?" They hadn't. Daniel was certain of it. The walls here were distinctive, veined with some crystalline mineral that caught the light in prismatic bursts. "No," he said carefully. "This is new territory." Mira's expression crumpled. "Then I'm losing more. Faster now." She grabbed his wrist suddenly, her fingers digging in. "If I forget who I am completely, leave me behind. Run, don't look back." "I'm not leaving you," Daniel said firmly. "You will," she replied with grim certainty. "When you see what happens to the forgotten ones." Before he could question her further, the tunnel emptied into a chamber unlike any they'd encountered before. It was vast, its ceiling lost in darkness above, but what seized Daniel's attention were the walls, every inch covered in carvings. Not the ancient symbols they'd seen near the entrance, but newer marks. Names, dates, messages. Hundreds of them, overlapping in places, some carved with tools, others seemingly scratched by desperate fingernails. "Oh God," Daniel breathed, sweeping his flashlight across the chaotic gallery. "Jennifer Pullman, 1973. Someone find me." "Carl White was here. Tell Sarah I'm sorry. I exist, I exist, I exist, I exist, I exist." Some names had been violently slashed through, the stone gouged as if by claws. Others faded mid-carving, the letters becoming indistinct, unfinished. "The memorial wall," Mira said, her voice distant. "Everyone who gets trapped carves their name eventually. A desperate bid to be remembered." "All these people," Daniel whispered. "How long has this been happening?" Mira shrugged. "The oldest dates I've found go back to the 1800s, but there are symbols that seem much, much older." Daniel moved, deeper into the chamber, his light catching something metal glinting on the ground. A rusted lantern, its glass cracked but intact. Beside it lay something that made his blood run cold, A small pile of photographs, faded and water-damaged but still recognizable. He knelt, picking one up carefully. A family portrait from what looked like the 1950s. Parents, 3 children, all smiling stiffly in their Sunday best. But the face of the youngest child had been scratched out, not casually but methodically, the paper worn through by repeated motions. Another photo showed a young couple from perhaps the 1970s, the woman's face similarly obliterated. Photo after photo, all with faces removed, some partially, others completely. What happened to these people? Daniel asked, holding up the stack. Mira barely glanced at them. They were forgotten, first by the world outside, then by themselves. And finally, she gestured to the scratched-out faces. The cave took what was left. Daniel dropped the photos as if they'd burned him. And that's what's happening to you? She nodded, not meeting his eyes. I can feel pieces going missing. Memories I know I should have but can't reach anymore, like trying to grab smoke. They continued across the chamber, picking their way around more abandoned possessions. A child's teddy bear, rotted to almost nothing. A rusted pocket knife, a wedding ring, its gold still gleaming despite the years. Near the center of the room, a still pool reflected the beam of Daniel's flashlight. Mira approached it cautiously, kneeling at its edge. She stared down at her reflection, her body growing progressively more rigid. "Mira?" Daniel called, sensing something wrong. She didn't respond, just continued staring, her breathing becoming rapid, shallow. Daniel hurried to her side, kneeling beside her. In the pool's reflection, he could see her face twisted in horror. "What's wrong?" he asked. "That's not me," she whispered, pointing at her reflection. "That's not my face." Daniel looked again, at the reflection. It looked exactly like Mira to him, the same gaunt features, the same wide, frightened eyes. "It is you," he assured her, "just like I see you." She shook her head violently. "No, no, no." Her voice rose to a scream as she slapped at the water, disrupting the image. "That's not what I look like. My hair isn't like that. My eyes aren't that color. Mira, calm down." "Who am I?" she demanded, grabbing the front of his jacket. "Tell me my name, tell me who I am." "You're Mira Caldwell," Daniel said, keeping his voice steady despite his growing alarm. "You were a park ranger. You went missing 5 years ago in these mountains." "Mira," she repeated, as if testing the name. "Mira Caldwell." Something seemed to settle in her, a momentary clarity returning to her eyes. "Yes, Mira, not Miranda. Mira." "Miranda?" Daniel asked. "Is that your full name?" She looked confused. I don't think so. But someone called me that once. Here, in the cave." Her brow furrowed with concentration. "Someone else who was lost. We traveled together for a while." "Another hiker?" "Yes, a man. He helped me. But I can't remember his face anymore. Or his name." Her eyes widened with sudden terror. "Oh God, I can't remember his name. We were together for months and I can't remember his name." As her distress grew, the air in the chamber seemed to thicken, vibrating with a strange energy. The whispers that had been a constant background presence suddenly intensified, becoming clear, distinct voices. "Mira. Daniel. Join us. Become part of the story." The voices came from everywhere and nowhere, some sounding eerily like Elliot, others unfamiliar but somehow intimate, as if they belonged to people Daniel should know. Mira clapped her hands over her ears. "Make it stop." Daniel pulled her to her feet. "We need to keep moving." His light caught something on the wall nearest them, a message carved in fresh, clean strokes, the stone dust still visible below it. "I was here. I was real. But now I am gone." Below it, a name had been partially carved. Mir. The final letters were missing, as if the carver had been interrupted. Mira stared at it, her face draining of what little color it had left. "I don't remember writing that," she whispered. "But that's my handwriting." A sound from the darkness behind them, that now familiar shuffling, but multiplied, coming from several directions at once. Daniel's light caught movement at the chamber's edges, figures emerging from the shadows, some walking normally, others crawling at impossible angles, all converging on their position. "Run!" Mira gasped, pulling Daniel toward the chamber's far side, where a narrow opening promised escape. They sprinted across the chamber, the sounds of pursuit growing louder. Daniel risked a glance back and immediately wished he hadn't. The figures following them wore human shapes but moved wrong, limbs bending in impossible ways, heads twisted at unnatural angles. Some had features that shifted and flowed like wax, never settling into a single face. One figure stood out from the rest, a woman whose appearance kept cycling between different versions of herself, as if she couldn't decide who she was. They reached the opening just as the nearest entities closed in. Daniel pushed Mira through first, then squeezed through himself, feeling cold fingers brush his ankle as he pulled free. The moment they were through, a rumble shook the passage. Daniel turned to see rocks falling, sealing the opening behind them, cutting off their pursuers. The cave had closed the path, not to trap them this time, but to guide them, herding them forward, deeper. In the sudden silence that followed, broken only by their ragged breathing, Mira slumped against the wall, sliding down until she sat on the cold stone floor. "It's getting worse," she said, her voice hollow. "My memories, they're going faster now." Daniel knelt beside her. "We'll find a way out before that happens." She looked up at him, a sad smile touching her lips. "You don't understand yet, do you? There is no out. Not in the way you think." She took a shuddering breath. "I've been through this before. With him. The one whose name I can't remember." "What do you mean?" "We thought we found an exit too. Followed it. But it led us right back to the memorial chamber." She gestured vaguely behind them where the passage was now blocked. Except it wasn't quite the same chamber, and he wasn't quite the same person anymore. A chill ran through Daniel. What happened to him? Mira's eyes unfocused, staring at something far away or long ago. He started forgetting pieces of himself. Then he started changing, and then her voice dropped to nearly inaudible. Then he joined them, the forgotten ones. And I ran. I ran, and I didn't look back. She looked up at Daniel, her gaze suddenly terrifyingly clear. The cave doesn't just take your memories, Daniel. It takes your humanity, piece by piece, until there's nothing left but an echo. The tunnel ahead of them seemed to breathe, walls expanding and contracting with slow, deliberate movements. Daniel helped Mira to her feet, his grip tightening when she swayed unsteadily. "Can you walk?" he asked. She nodded, though her eyes had taken on a glazed, distant quality that worried him. "For now, but I'm slipping, Daniel, faster than before." She touched her face as if trying to memorize its contours. "I keep forgetting what I look like, who I am." "Just hold on," Daniel said, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. "We'll find a way out." "There is no way out," she muttered, an echo of her earlier words. "Only through, always through." They continued down the passage, which grew steadily narrower until they were forced to walk single file, shoulders brushing against stone on both sides. The air thickened, becoming almost gelatinous, resisting their movements as if they were wading through invisible molasses. Daniel's flashlight began to behave strangely, its beam no longer traveling in a straight line but bending, curving around corners it shouldn't be able to illuminate. Shadows cast by the light moved independently of their sources, sliding across the walls like liquid. "The rules are different here," Mira whispered, noticing his confusion. "Physics bends." The passage eventually opened into a vast chamber, so large that Daniel's light couldn't reach the ceiling or far walls. But unlike the pitch darkness of the other chambers, this one was dimly lit by an ambient glow that seemed to emanate from the stone itself, a sickly, pulsating luminescence that made Daniel think of bioluminescent sea creatures in the ocean's deepest trenches. At the center of the chamber stood a solitary figure, Elliot, But unlike the echo they'd encountered earlier, the one with empty eyes and wrong movements, this Elliot looked wholly, perfectly real. He wore the same clothes from the day of the accident, but clean, undamaged. His posture was relaxed, his smile genuine. His eyes crinkled at the corners the way they always had when he was truly happy. "Dan," he called, his voice carrying a warmth that made Daniel's chest ache with recognition. "I've been waiting for you." "Don't," Mira hissed, grabbing Daniel's arm. "It's a trap. The final trap." Daniel stood frozen, torn between logic and longing. This Elliot was different from the twisted echo they'd encountered before. There was a substance to him, a wholeness that seemed impossible to fake. "It's not really him," Daniel said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Are you sure?" Elliot asked, taking a step closer. "Remember that summer at Lake Champlain? You were 12, I was 9. Dad rented that little blue sailboat and we tipped it over trying to race the McGrath brothers. Mom was so mad our clothes were ruined, but Dad couldn't stop laughing." Daniel's breath caught. That memory, specific, detailed, perfect, was real. A treasured childhood moment he hadn't thought about in years. "How could it know that?" he whispered. "It's in your head," Mira warned. "Reading your memories, using them against you." Elliot's expression shifted to one of concern. "Dan, you're exhausted, confused. This place is messing with your mind." He gestured to Mira. "You can't trust what you're experiencing. She's not what you think she is." Mira's grip on Daniel's arm tightened. "Don't listen. The cave speaks, with many voices, but they all tell lies." The ambient light in the chamber intensified, casting multiple shadows from where they stood. Shadows that moved wrong, twisting into shapes that resembled screaming faces before settling back into human outlines. Elliot stepped closer, his movements fluid, natural, perfect. "I found a way out, Dan. A real way out. But there's a catch." "What catch?" Daniel asked, unable to help himself. Mira pulled harder on his arm. "No, Daniel. Don't engage. Don't ask questions." But Elliot was already answering. "The cave requires balance. Someone enters. Someone leaves. That's the rule." He extended his hand. "You can go home, Dan. Back to your life. But someone has to stay behind." "You mean Mira?" Daniel said flatly. Elliot's smile was sad, understanding. "She's been here too long already. She's more a part of this place than the world outside now. You'd be doing her a kindness, really." "No," Daniel said immediately. "I won't abandon her." "Then you're both trapped," Elliot replied. "Forever." The whispers that had been a constant background presence suddenly intensified, rising to a deafening chorus of overlapping voices. Mira cried out, releasing Daniel's arm to press her hands against her ears. "Make it stop," she begged, falling to her knees. "I can't hear you over the voices," Daniel shouted to her, the whispers somehow affecting her more severely than him. Elliot remained undisturbed, as if the cacophony didn't exist for him. "They're calling her, Dan. They recognize one of their own." He reached out again. "But you still have a chance. Take my hand. I'll guide you out." "What happens to Mira if I go with you?" Daniel demanded. "She joins the others. Eventually she won't remember being anything else." Elliot shrugged, the gesture heartbreakingly familiar. "It's already happening. Look at her. She's forgetting herself piece by piece." Daniel turned to Mira, who had curled into herself on the chamber floor. Her lips moved rapidly, silently, as if reciting something. Her name, perhaps, or memories she was desperate not to lose. "There has to be another way," Daniel insisted. "There isn't," Elliot said softly. "But I can offer you something else. Something better than escape." His voice dropped to an intimate whisper. "I can give you a second chance." The chamber around them rippled like disturbed water, and suddenly they weren't in the cave at all. They stood on a familiar mountain trail, sunlight filtering through pine branches. The air was crisp, clean. Birds sang in the distance. "You can change it, Dan," Elliot said, gesturing to a scene unfolding further down the trail. Two hikers preparing their gear. With a jolt, Daniel recognized himself and Elliot, 5 years younger, on the day of the accident. "You can save me this time." Daniel watched, transfixed, as his younger self carelessly checked Elliot's harness, missing the critical buckle that would later fail. "Just step in. Warn them. Change everything." Elliot's voice was hypnotic, compelling. "We can go back to our lives together. Mom and Dad won't fall apart. You won't abandon your career. None of the pain needs to happen." It was everything Daniel had dreamed of for 5 years. A chance to undo his greatest regret. The illusion felt solid, real. He could smell the pine, feel the mountain breeze on his face. "All you have to do," Elliot continued, "is let go of the present. Let go of her." He nodded toward Mira, who had somehow remained in the scene, still curled on what now appeared as dirt trail rather than cave floor. Daniel took a step toward the hikers, drawn by longing so powerful it physically hurt. Then something caught his eye, movement on a nearby rock face. Letters carving themselves into stone. DANIELHOLT. His name, etching itself into the memorial wall that shouldn't exist in this sunlit forest. The carving continued, adding a date. Today's date. Daniel froze, reality crashing back. This wasn't a second chance. It was surrender. "No," he said, the word tearing from his throat. "This isn't real." The forest flickered around him. Mountain, vistas alternating with cave walls, sunlight with that sickly green glow. "It can be real," Elliot insisted, his perfect face now showing the first signs of strain. "If you let it be." "The real Elliot is gone," Daniel said, his voice strengthening. "He's been gone for 5 years, and he wouldn't ask me to sacrifice someone else to ease my guilt." The illusion shattered completely, forest dissolving back into the cave chamber. Elliot remained, but his appearance had changed. A subtle wrongness creeping in around the edges, his smile too fixed, his eyes too bright. "You can't save her," not Elliot said, his voice hardening. "She belongs to the cave now, just like the others. Just like you will eventually." "We'll find our own way out," Daniel replied, turning his back on the figure to kneel beside Mira. "There is no way out." The voice was no longer just Elliot's, but a chorus of voices, old, young, angry, desperate. "No one leaves without paying the price." "Mira," Daniel said urgently, ignoring the entity behind him. "Mira, focus on me. Tell me who you are. Tell me your name." Her eyes, glazed and unfocused, slowly found his. Mira, she whispered. "Mira Caldwell. That's right, hold on to that. What else do you remember?" "I was a ranger, Black Hollow Park." Each word seemed to cost her tremendous effort. "I had a dog, a retriever. His name was..." She faltered, panic flashing across her face. "It doesn't matter," Daniel assured her. "You're remembering, that's what matters." The figure of Elliot had begun to change, its form elongating, features melting and reforming. "You're making a mistake," it growled, voice deepening to something inhuman. "The cave always wins. Always." Daniel helped Mira to her feet, supporting her weight when she stumbled. "Let's go." "Where?" she asked weakly. "Away from here. Away from him." Daniel pointed to a passage on the far side of the chamber, the only opening other than the one they'd entered through. As they began to move, the entity that had been Elliot let out a sound, not quite a scream, not quite a roar, but something ancient and terrible that made the chamber tremble. Stones fell from above. Stalagmites shattered. "Run!" Daniel shouted, half carrying Mira as they raced for the passage. Behind them, the thing that was not Elliot howled its rage. A sound joined by countless other voices as the cave itself seemed to awaken fully to their defiance. They reached the passage just as the chamber began to collapse, rocks crashing down where they had stood moments before. Daniel pulled Mira into the tunnel, both of them gasping for breath as dust billowed around them. When the rumbling finally stopped and the dust began to settle, they found themselves in complete darkness. Daniel's flashlight, which had been failing for hours, had finally died. In the perfect blackness, Mira's voice came small but clear. "You didn't take the bargain?" "No," Daniel replied simply. "Why not?" Daniel thought of Elliot, the real Elliot, not the cave's twisted version. Because some prices are too high, even to undo the past. In the darkness, Mira's hand found his, her grip surprisingly strong. Then we face what comes next together. In absolute darkness, Daniel and Mira inched forward through the narrow tunnel, guided only by touch. The stone beneath their fingers vibrated with a persistent tremor, as if the mountain itself was seething with rage. "It's never been this angry before," Mira whispered, her voice unnaturally close in the blackness. "Not in all my time here." "Because we refused the bargain," Daniel said. "We defied it." A violent shudder ran through the passage, dislodging stones that clattered around them. Daniel pulled Mira closer, shielding her as debris rained down. "We need light," he muttered, fumbling through his pack. His fingers closed around a small emergency lighter he kept with his first aid supplies. The flame it produced would be meager, but better than nothing. The lighter sparked to life, its small flame casting long, distorted shadows. The passage ahead split into two branches, both identical in appearance. "Which way?" Daniel asked. Mira stared at the diverging paths, her expression blank. I don't..." She pressed her hands to her temples. "I can't remember how to navigate anymore. The patterns are gone." Another tremor, stronger this time, shook the tunnel. Cracks appeared in the ceiling, fine lines spreading like spider webs through the stone. "We need to move," Daniel said urgently. "Now!" As they stepped forward, the trembling intensified. The ground bucked beneath their feet, throwing them off balance. A deafening crack split the air as a fissure opened between them, the floor separating with impossible speed. Daniel lunged for Mira's hand, his fingers brushing hers for a fraction of a second before she was pulled away, the gap widening too quickly to cross. "Mira!" he shouted as she stumbled backward, the tunnel floor beneath her tilting sharply downward. "Daniel!" Her scream echoed as she slid into darkness, vanishing down the right-hand passage. Before he could move to follow, the passage she'd fallen into collapsed, tons of rock sealing it completely. The force of the cave-in threw Daniel backward, sending him tumbling down the left passage. The lighter knocked from his grasp, plunging him back into darkness. He fell for what seemed like an impossible distance, bouncing off stone walls, pain flaring with each impact. When he finally came to rest on a relatively flat surface, every breath sent spikes of agony through his ribs. "Mira!" he called out, his voice swallowed by the void. Only echoes returned, not of his own voice, but of many others. "Too late. She's ours now. Join us, Daniel." The whispers surrounded him, pressing closer in the absolute darkness. Without sight, his other senses heightened, unnaturally. He could feel presences moving around him, cold spots that brushed against his skin, bringing with them fractured memories that didn't belong to him. A child's laughter on a beach he'd never visited, the scent of perfume he'd never smelled before, the weight of a wedding ring on a finger though he'd never married. Foreign memories flooding his consciousness, threatening to drown his own. "Get out of my head," he growled, pressing his palms against his ears, though he knew it wouldn't help. Something brushed against his face, fingers cold as stone. Another touch on his shoulder, then his back. The echoes were surrounding him, becoming bolder without light to dispel them. In desperation, Daniel fumbled through his pack again, searching for anything that might produce light. His fingers closed around Mira's journal, then moved to his own pocket where he kept his wallet. Inside, he found what he was looking for, the small photograph of Elliot he always carried. An idea formed, born of instinct rather than logic. He'd been fighting the cave, fighting the memories. Maybe that was wrong. Maybe he needed to face them instead. "Elliot," he said clearly into the darkness. "I know you're not here. I know what's wearing your face, isn't you? But I need to speak to you anyway." The cold touches withdrew slightly. The whispers quieted. "I've been carrying guilt for 5 years," Daniel continued, his voice strengthening. "Blaming myself for not checking your harness properly, for not being able to catch you when you fell, for surviving when you didn't." The darkness seemed to thicken, coalescing into a vaguely human shape before him. Not solid, but denser than the surrounding void. It didn't speak, but Daniel knew it was listening. But the truth is, it was an accident. A terrible, senseless accident. And no amount of guilt can bring you back. His voice broke slightly. "The real you. Not this echo." The figure moved. Closer, its features resolving into Elliot's face, but unstable, shifting between the brother he remembered and something older, hungrier. Other faces flickered beneath the surface, dozens of them, all consumed by whatever entity now approached him. "You aren't my brother," Daniel said firmly. "You're the cave. You're what takes people when they can't let go of their past." The figure stopped, its form rippling like disturbed water. When it spoke, the voice was still Elliot's, but layered with countless others. "I am what remains when everything else is gone." "No." Daniel shook his head. "You're what feeds on what remains. There's a difference." He stood straighter, ignoring the pain in his ribs. "I loved my brother. I will always miss him. But he is gone, and I need to accept that." The entity drifted closer, its form becoming less human with each passing second. "Then you accept your fate here," it hissed. "To join with us, to become Echo." "I didn't say that," Daniel replied. "I'm leaving this cave, and I'm taking Mira with me, if she's still alive." The thing laughed, a sound like stone grinding against stone. "She is already becoming memory, already forgetting herself." "Then I'll help her remember," Daniel said. He took a step forward, directly challenging the entity. "I know how you work now. You feed on regret, on guilt, on the past. You trap people in loops of their own making. But what happens when someone refuses to be trapped?" The entity's form wavered, uncertainty apparent in its shifting features. In that moment of weakness, Daniel saw many faces beneath Elliot's, men and women from different eras, all with the same hollow, hungry expressions. "You're nothing but a parasite," Daniel continued, taking another step. "Feeding on others because you have nothing of your own." The entity recoiled, its form destabilizing further. Glimpses of its true nature showed through the cracks, not a sentient being but a force ancient and mindless that had evolved to feed on human grief. "Elliot is dead," Daniel stated clearly, feeling the truth of it settle in his bones. "And I need to live." With those words, something shifted. The entity before him shuddered violently, fragments of its form breaking away like shards of glass, revealing emptiness beneath. It tried to maintain Elliot's features, but they dissolved under Daniel's unflinching gaze. "Goodbye, Elliot," Daniel whispered, not to the thing before him, but to the memory of his brother. A real goodbye, not clouded by guilt or regret. The entity keened, a sound of frustrated hunger rather than pain, and lunged for him. Daniel stood his ground, refusing to flinch even as the cold presence passed through him. And then it was gone, dissipating like smoke, leaving behind a silence different from before, cleaner, less oppressive. In the moment of stillness that followed, Daniel noticed something he'd missed. A faint illumination, barely visible, coming from somewhere above him. Not artificial light, but something softer, more natural. Daylight. A crack in the ceiling, so narrow he might have overlooked it if not for the perfect darkness surrounding it. Fresh air whispered through, carrying the scent of pine and earth. An exit. A real one. Daniel moved beneath it, assessing its height, at least 15 feet above, through solid rock. Climbing would be difficult, perhaps impossible without equipment. "Mira?" he called out, hoping against hope that she might have found her way to this chamber through another route. No answer came. The crack of light beckoned. A way out, back to the world, back to life. But Mira was still somewhere in the darkness. If she was still alive, still herself. Daniel closed his eyes, weighing his options. He could try to find her, but without light, without any sense of direction, he'd likely become hopelessly lost. The cave was vast, and she could be anywhere. Or he could try to escape himself, then bring back help. But he knew the truth. If he left her behind, she might not be herself when he returned, if he could even find the cave entrance again. Hours or days could pass in the outside world while the cave continued to feed on her identity. The light above him flickered as clouds presumably passed overhead. His way out. His chance at survival. But at what cost? Daniel took one last look at the crack of daylight, then turned away, facing the darkness where Mira had disappeared. "I'm coming for you," he called out, hoping his voice would somehow reach her. "Hold on to who you are, remember your name, I'm coming." With the photograph of Elliot clutched in one hand and Mira's journal in the other, Daniel stepped back into the darkness, guided only by the conviction that neither of them would become just another echo in the cave's ancient hunger. Daniel remembered only fragments of what happened after he ventured back into the darkness. The search for Mira had led him deeper into the cave's labyrinth, through passages that twisted in ways that defied physical laws. He'd called her name until his voice gave out, guided only by instinct and desperate hope. Then somehow there had been light, not the artificial beam of a flashlight or the sickly glow of phosphorescent fungi, but real sunlight streaming through an opening in the rock, and Mira's hand in his, pulling him toward it with surprising strength. "Run!" she had shouted. "Don't! Look back!" They had scrambled toward the light, the cave shuddering around them, stones falling, the very air vibrating with rage. Something had clutched at Daniel's ankle. Cold fingers, inhuman in their strength. But Mira had pulled harder, and then they were through the opening, tumbling onto moss-covered ground as the cave entrance collapsed behind them. Now, Daniel blinked in the harsh daylight, his lungs burning with each breath of fresh air. Beside him, Mira lay motionless, her face turned away. "Mira," he croaked, his throat raw. "Are you okay?" When she didn't respond, he crawled to her side, gently turning her face toward him. Her eyes were closed, her features peaceful. For one terrible moment, he thought she was dead. But no. Her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. "Mira, wake up." He shook her gently. "We made it. We're out." Her eyelids fluttered, then opened. She stared at him with no recognition. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice flat. Daniel's heart sank. "It's me, Daniel. We were trapped in the cave, together." Confusion wrinkled her brow. "Cave? I don't—" She looked around, taking in the forest, the sunlight filtering through leaves. "Where am I?" "Black Hollow Mountains," Daniel said. "You were a park ranger here, remember? You went missing 5 years ago." She sat up slowly, looking down at her dirt-encrusted clothes, her fingers touching the fabric as if it belonged to someone else. "I don't remember any of that." Daniel helped her to her feet, supporting her when she swayed unsteadily. "It's okay. The cave, it takes memories. But they might come back now that we're out." Mira nodded absently, her gaze distant. There was something unsettling about her movements, slightly too smooth, as if she was performing an approximation of human motion rather than moving naturally. "We need to get back to civilization," Daniel said, pulling out his compass. It spun wildly for a moment before settling. "This way should lead us to the trail." They walked in silence, Daniel constantly checking on Mira, who followed with that same strange gliding gait. The forest around them was unnervingly quiet. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just the sound of their own footsteps and breathing. Daniel tried to orient himself using landmarks, but nothing looked familiar. The trees seemed wrong somehow, slightly too tall, their bark a shade darker than it should be. The sun shone through the canopy, but its light was a peculiar blue-white that cast everything in an otherworldly glow. After walking for what felt like hours, they reached a clearing. Daniel's car sat exactly where he'd left it, but like everything else, it seemed subtly altered. The same model and color, but somehow newer, cleaner, as if it had just rolled off the assembly line rather than weathered years of use. "That's not right," he muttered, running his hand over the unmarred surface where there should have been a dent from a minor fender bender last year. "What's wrong?" Mira asked, her voice still unnaturally flat. "Nothing," Daniel said quickly. "Let's just get out of here." He found his keys exactly where he'd hidden them above the wheel well, another detail that was correct, yet felt wrong. When he started the engine, the dashboard lit up with unfamiliar indicators, though the car was ostensibly the same model as his own. As they drove down the mountain road toward town, Daniel's unease grew. The landscape was recognizable in its general features, the same winding road, the same vista of valleys below, but details were off. Colors too vibrant, shadows too sharp, the quality of light all wrong. "Do you remember anything at all?" he asked Mira, desperate to break the silence. She stared out the window, her expression blank. "I remember darkness and whispers. Nothing else." They reached the small town at the base of the mountain by mid-afternoon. Main Street looked the same at first glance, the same storefronts, the same layout, but again the details were jarring. The local diner, which had been painted a faded blue for as long as Daniel could remember, was now a pristine white. The town square's ancient oak tree, which should have been enormous, was noticeably smaller. Daniel parked in front of the sheriff's office, his hands trembling on the wheel. "Wait here," he told Mira. "I'm going to get help." Inside, he found Sheriff Williams at her desk, but not the middle-aged woman with salt and pepper hair he knew. This Sheriff Williams was younger, her hair still fully black, though she wore the same name tag. "Can I help you?" she asked, looking up from her paperwork. "Sheriff, it's me, Daniel Holt," he said. "I've found Mira Caldwell, the ranger who went missing 5 years ago." The sheriff frowned. "I'm sorry, who?" "Mira Caldwell," Daniel repeated. "The park ranger. There was a massive search operation when she disappeared. It was all over the local news." Sheriff Williams shook her head slowly. "Sir, I've been sheriff, here for 8 years. We've never had a missing park ranger case, and I don't recall anyone by that name." "That's impossible," Daniel insisted. "And you know me. I've lived in this town my whole life." Her frown deepened. "I'm sorry, but I don't believe we've met before today." Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. He pulled out his wallet, fumbling for his driver's license. When he found it, the photo showed his face, but the name printed beside it was blank, just a series of meaningless characters that seemed to shift when he tried to focus on them. "This isn't right," he muttered. "None of this is right." "Sir, are you feeling all right?" the sheriff asked, concern creeping into her voice. "Do you need medical assistance?" Daniel backed toward the door. "No, I'm fine. Sorry to bother you." Outside, he found Mira exactly where he'd left her, staring straight ahead with that same empty expression. He slid back into the driver's seat, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip the wheel. "They don't remember," he said. "They don't remember you or me." Mira turned to look at him, her movements still unnaturally smooth. "Perhaps we're not who we think we are." A chill ran down Daniel's spine at her words. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts. Names he didn't recognize, numbers with too many or too few digits. His photo gallery held images of places he'd never been, people he'd never met. Desperate now, he drove to his own apartment building, running up the stairs to his unit. The key fit the lock, but when he opened the door, he found a space that was both his and not his. The same layout, similar furniture, but all wrong in subtle ways. No photographs on the walls. No personal touches. In the bathroom, he gripped the edges of the sink and forced himself to look in the mirror. His reflection stared back. But there was a delay. A split-second lag between his movements and those of his mirror image. And behind his own eyes, he caught a glimpse of something else, something hollow, hungry. "Did you really escape?" A whisper came from behind him. Daniel whirled around, but there was no one there. When he turned back, to the mirror his reflection smiled, though he himself was not smiling. He stumbled backward out of the bathroom, out of the apartment. Mira waited in the hallway, her head tilted at an angle just slightly too acute to be natural. "The cave," Daniel whispered. "We never left, did we?" Mira's expression remained blank. "Does it matter? This is reality now." "No." Daniel shook his head violently. "This is another trick, another illusion." He rushed past her down the stairs out onto the street. The sky above was that same unnatural blue, too perfect, too uniform. The people walking by moved with that same uncanny smoothness that characterized Mira's movements. None of them looked at him directly. Daniel ran, not knowing where he was going, only that he had to get away. But everywhere he turned, the wrongness followed. Buildings that should have been familiar stood altered in subtle ways. Streets led to places they shouldn't. Finally, exhausted, he found himself at the edge of town, where forest began again. The trees beckoned, dark and silent, promising answers, or perhaps oblivion. "You can't run from what you've become," came Mira's voice from behind him. He turned to find her standing there, but something had changed. Her features seemed to ripple slightly, like a reflection in disturbed water. And when she smiled, it was with too many teeth. "What am I?" Daniel asked, his voice barely a whisper. "An echo," she replied. "Just like me. Part of the cave, even, when you think you've escaped it." "No," Daniel backed away. "I got out. We both did." "Did we?" Mira's form flickered, momentarily revealing something else beneath, something ancient and hungry. Or did the cave simply expand? Daniel felt the ground shift beneath his feet, solid earth momentarily becoming as insubstantial as a dream. The sky above rippled like water, and in the distance, where mountains should have been, he saw only darkness, a vast, yawning void. "The cave doesn't just trap bodies," Mira said, her voice overlapping with others now, a chorus of lost souls. "It traps consciousness, reality. Even when you think you're free, you're still inside, still part of the story." Daniel collapsed to his knees, the truth crashing over him in waves. They had never escaped. Perhaps there had never been an escape to find. And as he knelt there, at the edge of a town that both was and wasn't real, he heard it, a whisper, so faint he almost missed it. A familiar voice calling his name. Not Mira's voice, not Elliot's. His own. "Daniel," it called from somewhere beyond the illusion. "Daniel, wake up." He lifted his head, searching for the source. And there, just for a moment, he thought he saw a crack in the perfect blue sky, a fissure through which genuine sunlight streamed. Another reality, perhaps. The true reality. But before he could move toward it, Mira's hand closed around his wrist, her grip inhumanly strong. "Stay," she said. "It's easier this way." Daniel looked into her eyes, eyes that had never belonged to the real Mira Caldwell, and saw the truth. This wasn't Mira. This was the cave itself, wearing her face just as it had worn Elliot's. "You're not real," he said firmly. The thing wearing Mira's face smiled again, its features sliding further into wrongness. "Neither are you. Not anymore." But that voice was still calling, still pulling at something deep inside him. Daniel focused on it, letting it anchor him, as the world around him began to dissolve. "Come back," the voice urged. "Follow my voice." Daniel closed his eyes, shutting out the false reality, concentrating only on that distant call. It felt like drowning in reverse, fighting not against water but against an absence, a void that wanted to keep him. When he opened his eyes again, the false Mira was gone. The false town had vanished. He stood alone in absolute darkness, with only that voice to guide him. "I'm coming," he whispered, reaching toward the sound, toward what he hoped was reality. True reality. His fingers found something solid, a hand, warm and human, gripping his tightly, pulling him forward out of the darkness and into, "Daniel, can you hear me? Squeeze my hand if you can hear me." Light assaulted his eyes, harsh, artificial light. Voices surrounded him, urgent and professional. The steady beep of medical equipment. "He's responding," someone said. Pupils reactive, heart rate stabilizing. Daniel blinked, the world slowly coming into focus. A hospital room, medical staff moving around him, and sitting beside his bed, clutching his hand, a woman he'd never seen before, and yet somehow knew. "Mira?" he croaked, his throat raw, as if he'd been screaming for hours. The woman's eyes widened. "Yes," she whispered. "But how did you know my name?" Before he could answer, a doctor leaned over him. "Mr. Holt, you've been in a coma for 3 days. We found you collapsed at the mouth of a cave system in Black Hollow. Do you remember what happened?" Daniel looked from the doctor to the woman to Mira, trying to reconcile the gaunt, haunted figure from the cave with this healthy, concerned stranger. "I was hiking," he began slowly. "I found a cave." "The same cave I was documenting," Mira interjected. "I'm with the Geological Survey. I heard you calling for help from inside, but by the time I reached you, you were unconscious." Daniel stared at her, searching for any sign of recognition, any hint that she shared his memories of their time together in the darkness. But her eyes held only professional concern, not the haunted knowledge he expected. "Thank you," he managed, "for finding me." She nodded, a small smile touching her lips. "Just doing my job." As the medical staff continued their examination, Daniel caught a glimpse of his reflection in the metal side of a medical cart, distorted but recognizable. His own face stared back at him, moving in perfect synchronization with his movements. Relief washed over him. A dream, then, a hallucination brought on by injury or gas in the cave, nothing more. But as Mira turned to speak with the doctor, Daniel noticed something on her wrist. A thin bracelet handmade from what looked like cave fungi woven together. A bracelet he remembered making for her, during their time trapped together, to help her remember who she was. A bracelet that couldn't exist if it had all been a dream. Her eyes met his again, and for just a moment, he saw something flicker behind them. A knowledge, a shared secret. Then it was gone, replaced by the professional mask she wore. "Rest," she said softly. "You're safe now." But as she spoke, Daniel caught a glimpse of his reflection again, and this time, just for a split second, it smiled without him, a smile too wide with too many teeth. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, it would mean a lot.